When they boarded what was to be a relaxing cruise, they could not have had any idea they were sailing right into the jaws of terror. The crisp morning air carried the scent of salt water as the Thompson family made their way onto the grand luxury cruise ship, the Ocean Spirit. This was supposed to be their dream vacation, a fresh start. The family, from a small town in the Midwest, had been going through hard times. Mark Thompson, a middle-aged father with his hair graying, had recently lost his job. His wife, Emily, is a warm and caring woman who happens to be doing 2 jobs in order to make ends meet. Their teenage daughter, Lily, 16, spent most of her time concealing her sadness due to her father's unemployment behind a nose buried in books. But the cruise, this wonderful vacation, would have been their time. The method this family used to step back from the past and look forward into brighter days. When they got aboard this enormous vessel, they couldn't help but notice the glistening white hull and sparkling pools and promise of non-stop rest. They welcomed them warmly aboard. The members of staff who served them a dinner and so forth offered complimentary drinks along the way as they found their cabin, an ample suite rather unlike their own cramped apartment complex. The first few days were nothing short of magical. Mark felt a weight lift off his shoulders as he sipped a cool drink by the poolside, watching the waves crash against the side of the ship. Emily laughed with the other guests, finding solace in the luxury she had never known. Lily, though quieter than usual, was taking in the sights, her eyes wide with wonder. But as the ship continued on its way into the vast ocean, strange things began to happen. It started with the guests. People who had been enjoying the cruise suddenly began to act differently. One evening at dinner, a woman seated at the table next to the Thompsons kept whispering to herself, her eyes wide and unblinking. Her husband seemed oblivious, picking at his food as if nothing were wrong. She mutters louder. Mark sees the shakiness in her hands while she reaches out for her water glass. The time she looks up, their eyes meet. She is as white as a bedsheet, her lips quivering as she mutters, "They're watching." He felt a cold run down his spine. Next came the staff. Several warm crew members welcoming them seemed to vanish into nowhere. One morning, the Thompsons noticed a young waitress, Carla, who had served them at breakfast, standing at the end of a hallway staring blankly into the wall. Her eyes seemed vacant, and when Emily attempted to speak to her, there was no reply. When Emily touched her shoulder, Carla turned slowly, and her face looked ghostly white, her lips parted. Yet no words could be heard coming out. "Is she okay?" Emily asked, barely above a whisper. Before Carla could answer, the loud alarm blasted through the ship, announcing that they were diverting from course. The crew sprang into action, racing to their stations. Carla headed off without comment, but there was something badly wrong, and Emily knew it. The first night they noticed the noises. It started with a soft creaking in the walls of their cabin. Initially, Mark complained that the ship's structure was creating this noise, but it grew louder like steps. The sounds become more audible at irregular intervals through the dead of night, and once they were dropping off to sleep, and the whispers, low, inaudible mutters seeming to emanate from the walls themselves. Mark, who never thought of himself as a coward in front of his family, started to get a creeping feeling. One night, after Lily woke him from a nightmare, they heard it again. But this time louder. It sounded as if something was running through the halls. Mark rushed to their cabin door, flung it open, but the hallway looked eerily empty. "Dad, what if the ship is haunted?" Lily whispered, her voice shaking. Emily gave her a reassuring smile, but tension was writ on her face. "Sweetheart, there is no such thing as ghosts." Yet, at the back of her mind, she didn't really believe that. Days were moving on. Then, incidents got more strange and frequent. Air in the ship was thickened, and some old and bad omen was coming nearer to them as if in some slow movement. Guests began to panic. A woman threw herself overboard after claiming she saw someone staring at her through the window of her cabin, someone who was not on the ship. Her husband screamed at the crew, demanding answers, but there were no explanations. The panic spread quickly. Some people refused to leave their cabins, locking themselves in and shouting at the crew to stay away. It was as if every passing day the ship was becoming a powder keg of fear. It was not just the guests. Even the crew members began to behave abnormal. There was a young fellow named George who had been all smiles when they boarded the ship. He would sit there for hours, staring at the ocean without moving, and when he did speak, his voice was hollow, as if it came from somewhere deep in the bowels of the ship. One afternoon, Mark found him in the kitchen slicing a loaf of bread, his hand trembling as he sawed through the crust. When Mark asked if he was okay, George looked up at him with wide, unfocused eyes. "They're coming for us," George said, turning back to his work without saying another word. Emily insisted on staying close to her family at all times. Every time they crossed paths with a crew member, they seemed to be growing more distant, more detached from the world they once knew. And always, the whispers, the footsteps, the shadows in the corners of their vision. One night, when the ship was far from shore, Mark decided to investigate. He wandered through the empty hallways, flashlight in hand. The ship was unnervingly silent, but as he moved deeper into the bowels of the ship, the temperature dropped. His breath became visible in the air, despite the warm ocean breeze outside. He could feel eyes watching him. He suddenly found himself in front of an old locked door in a forgotten hallway. The door seemed out of place, as if it didn't belong. He pushed on it, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers around him grew louder, like voices crying out in pain, echoing from within. His heart was racing as he pressed his ear to the door and heard someone mumbling in the dark. He stepped back fast, but he didn't get out of there before a figure appeared in the doorway. It was Carla, the waitress who had been acting so strange. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with terror. "You shouldn't be here," she said in a low, almost guttural voice. "They're angry. They won't let us leave." And with that, she vanished into thin air. Mark ran back to his family, his mind in a whirl. He did not know what he saw, but he knew it was not normal. He needed answers. The ship was no longer a luxury cruise. It was a vessel of torment. The passengers had turned on one another, afraid and desperate. Many had fled to their rooms, barricading themselves in, while others screamed into the night, begging for rescue. The Thompsons, who were excited for this vacation, found themselves fighting for their lives. One evening, as they tried to find safety in the upper decks, they were confronted by a woman, her body disfigured, her face scarred, as though it had been burned. She was one of the original passengers from years ago, a victim of a tragic fire that had claimed the lives of hundreds of people. Her ghost was restless, seeking revenge on anyone who dared to step aboard the ship that had become her tomb. "You can't get away," she hissed, reaching out to grab Emily's arm. "This is our prison, and now you are ours." At that moment, Mark realized the horrifying truth. The ship had been cursed from the very moment it had set sail. The spirits of those who died in tragic, mysterious ways were trapped in the walls of the ship, unable to move on. And now, they were coming for the Thompsons, for everyone aboard. But they were not alone in this fight. The spirits of the innocent passengers, the ones who had never intended to harm anyone, rose up against the evil entities that had taken control of the ship. Mark, Emily, and Lily had to fight for their lives and also for their souls. As the ship sank deeper into chaos, Mark and Emily made a decision. They could not wait for help. They could not trust the ship to save them. They had to do it themselves. With Lily's help, they found the ship's emergency beacon and sent a distress signal out into the night. But as they tried to make their way to the lifeboats, the spirits grew stronger. Mark, Emily, and Lily fought their way through the ship's hallways, knowing they wouldn't all make it. At the last moment, as they reached the lifeboats, Mark turned back to see the ghostly figures closing in. Emily screamed for him to come, but he stayed behind. "Go!" he shouted. "I'll hold them off!" Tearing, Emily and Lily had to leave Mark behind. As the lifeboat pulled away from the sinking ship, they watched in horror as the ocean spirit disappeared into the fog. Months later, Emily and Lily finally stood on the solid ground, trying to rebuild their lives, but the horrors of that ship and haunting memories never left them. And each time they crossed the ocean, they couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere deep in the vastness of the sea, the ocean spirit still lingered, waiting to claim more souls. Before we dive deeper into further story, I just want to quickly mention something important. Check this out. According to the stats, 90% of you are watching my videos, but haven't subscribed to the channel yet. If you're enjoying the content, please hit that subscribe button. It only takes a second, and it helps me create more amazing content for you. Your support really means a lot. Let's grow this community together. They thought they were renting a peaceful getaway. They didn't realize the host had a deadly agenda. The weekend began like any other getaway, a peaceful retreat that seemed too good to be true. Sarah had been looking forward to the trip for months. The stresses of her life had been suffocating: long hours at the office, strained relationships, and a constant buzz of anxiety in the back of her mind. A weekend in the countryside, far from the chaos, was just what she needed. Her friends, Emily, Jack, and Rachel, had all felt the same way. This farm rental was just that kind of idyllic getaway that you always find on Instagram. Whitewashed walls, long porch lined with rocking chairs, and long oak shadows reaching into the day as the sun starts to dip into night. It sat nestled in some miles of the closest town on rural land, one of those places where the world could sometimes just fade into forgetfulness for a little while. The listing for the Airbnb was to be rustic, peaceful. Warm photos of the house depicted cozy rooms and views of endless fields. Sarah was skeptical, but the price was right, and the glowing reviews were enough to convince her. Perfect for a weekend retreat, they said. A real escape from the noise. What they failed to notice in the reviews was what lay behind the charming facade. When they arrived, a man in his early 50s stood at the front porch, his broad shoulders framed by the setting sun. He had a kind face, warm eyes that made Sarah feel comfortable immediately. He introduced himself as Robert, the owner of the farmhouse. His voice was calm and low, and he seemed eager to make them feel at home. "Let me show you around," Robert said, and he led them through the front door. Inside, it was just as sweet as the pictures had promised, with wooden beams and large windows that let in the golden light. The air smelled faintly of cedarwood, and everything was impeccably clean. As Robert led them through the rooms, he mentioned every little thing in the house as a fond parent showing around their child. "This is my farmhouse since generations," said Robert with nostalgic feelings. "It's an abode to the travelers over years." Sarah smiled politely but sensed something wasn't quite right. He was being too forward, almost too perfect in his hospitality. She was walking around the house with them, and all of a sudden, she kept hearing this creaking from upstairs, the attic, maybe. She glanced over at her friends, but they seemed not to have noticed it. They were getting lost in the charm of the house already, talking excitedly about what they would do that weekend. Robert's smile grew wide as he showed them the back door that opened to a large, overgrown garden. "Feel free to explore the land. But don't go into the woods. It's easy to get lost out there," he added in a hushed tone. His gaze was sharp, almost warning. Rachel laughed it off. "Thanks for the tip," she said, though Sarah could well sense that this was more of a suggestion rather than a soft word from Robert. At nightfall, the house came alive under the creaking of the floorboards and the groans it made from the ancient foundation. The four friends spent their night, as the farmhouse was incredibly beautiful and felt, in some ways, ancient. It seemed to have lived for so long that it had saved memories that were too dark for them to surface. Around midnight, the first unusual happening occurred while sipping wine, catching up. A loud noise came from upstairs in the attic, accompanied by what seemed to be steps, and then everybody stayed frozen. That was something. What was it? Emily quietly asked. Doubtless old house settling, Jack replied by shaking his head. But the noise continued, soft thuds, then a scrape, as if something or someone was moving above them. Sarah's heart was racing, but she said nothing. The others were brushing it off, so she didn't want to sound paranoid. But deep down, she felt it, the undeniable tension that thickened the air. The house, with its creaks and groans, wasn't as charming as it seemed. It wasn't long after this that the party decided to go off to their rooms. Sarah couldn't shake off the feeling, but she pushed it aside, reasoning that it was just the loneliness. The night was silent except for the noises that came from upstairs. But something even more bizarre then occurred. Sarah lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling. She heard a voice low, almost silent. "Help." Her heart skipped a beat. Was it coming from the attic? She sat up in bed, listening intently. The voice was gone, but it had been replaced by the creaking and whistling of the wind as it cut through the trees outside. Yet, the words helped reverberated within her head, giving her goosebumps. Still unable to shake off the feeling, Sarah got up and began quietly tiptoeing down the hallway in her mind. The house was old. Perhaps everything had a plausible explanation. However, then she saw something that she had never seen before. A door partially open at the end of the hall. She recalled that it had been locked before. It was not anymore. The next day, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. She found herself thinking about the attic and the locked door. Robert was nowhere to be found when they woke up, leaving the group to explore the grounds. As they wandered through the garden and the nearby fields, Sarah noticed something strange, a small, overgrown path that led toward the woods Robert had warned them about. Though she was afraid, curiosity overpowered her, and Sarah went down the way, with her friends unwillingly following. The deeper into the woods they went, the more Sarah worried. The air was heavy, dense, a feeling that someone watched them. The trees seemed to surround her, blocking out any light. It was then that she saw it, an old, dilapidated cabin half hidden behind thick brush. It was eerily quiet, but there was something familiar about it. Sarah felt herself being drawn toward it. The others did not seem to share her sense of urgency to investigate the cabin, but Sarah could not shake the feeling that the cabin was part of the story and that they needed to understand it. They crept close, and as they looked in, they saw something that made Sarah's blood run cold. Old photos, clipped to the walls, faded and yellowed with age. In each photo, there was Robert. But something was wrong with him in each one. His face was out of focus, his features twisted. And in the background, murky in shadows, were shapes tall, indistinct but unmistakably watching. And suddenly, she felt a hand touch her shoulder. She spun to see Emily with a deathly pale face. "Sarah, we need to go, now." Everything broke loose that night. The gang had congregated in the living room, restless and tense, following the discovery they made. "I think we should leave," Sarah stammered, her voice cracking. "Something is off about this place. We should get out of here before it gets too late." Rachel looked at her, unsure. You're being paranoid. It's just a house. Let's just relax." But Jack and Emily were both quiet, their faces reflecting the same unease Sarah had been feeling all along. They didn't get the chance to leave. The door slammed open. Robert stood in the doorway, his eyes wild. "You shouldn't have gone into the woods," he said, his voice shaking. "I told you to stay away from there." The group froze. The gracious host, who had welcomed them with such warmth and hospitality, had turned into a stranger, one harboring a terrible, dreadful secret. "I didn't want to do this," Robert said, almost apologetically, stepping closer. "But you've seen too much. Seen too much." Sarah felt the air thicken, the pressure rising. It was then that the attic door creaked open, and from the shadows, something emerged, a figure, pale and gaunt, dragging a chain behind it. The truth was clear now. The house wasn't haunted by memories alone, but by the people Robert lured here. People who never left. And as the group ran, as the figure reached for them, Sarah realized that the house had always been waiting for them. The farmhouse stood silent once again, the whispers of its previous inhabitants lost in time. What had begun with laughter and excitement at the weekend getaway ended chillingly. And Robert, he was still there, the house's dark heart. And when the next travelers came, not knowing what lay in store for them, they would find themselves trapped too, just like all the others. Because the host was never quite what he seemed. A keeper of souls, a collector who knew that sometimes the most peaceful places hide the darkest horrors. And for those who come seeking peace, no escape. This version has an emotional build-up, suspense, and the gradual revelation of sinister details, humanizing the horror through Sarah's perspective. The tension increases as they start noticing small but unsettling signs of danger, culminating in the terrifying realization that their peaceful retreat was part of a much darker, deadly legacy. What was intended to be a relaxing getaway turned out to be a fight for survival when the guests at this luxury resort disappeared without a trace. Lena and Mark had been waiting for this trip for months. After a trying year of working, the couple was looking forward to escaping chaos in their lives and indulging in a relaxed, once-in-a-lifetime retreat. They heard of an exclusive seaside resort called the Horizon View, built on the cliff overlooking the pounding waves, and knew they had to go. Reviews were glowing about world-class amenities, ocean vistas, and the level of luxury that seemed almost too good to be true. It felt like the perfect escape from the stress of their careers and the weight of the world. "Just think about it," Lena said, eyes shining as she scrolled through photos. "Waking up each morning to that view. It's like paradise." Mark laughed at this, a tease in his voice. "Hope it isn't too good to be true. We've gotten burned on perfect places before." They both laughed, but there was a lingering excitement in the air. They booked the trip that night, and the following week they found themselves driving toward the remote resort, passing through winding roads surrounded by towering trees and steep cliffs. The drive felt surreal, like they were entering another world. The further they went, the more isolated they became from the rest of civilization. When they arrived at the Horizon View, the resort looked exactly like the photos, luxurious, pristine, and impossibly beautiful. The grand entrance was marked by a massive stone archway, and the lobby was bathed in soft golden light, with marble floors that reflected the chandeliers above. The air smelled faintly of sea salt and jasmine, a calming combination that made their tired minds relax instantly. "Welcome to the Horizon View." The receptionist greeted them with a smile that seemed just a little too wide. "We're so pleased to have you here. Let me show you to your room." The young woman handed them 2 keys. golden cards engraved with the logo of the resort, and led them to a private suite overlooking the ocean. The suite was more spectacular than they had imagined. Huge windows offered an unobstructed view of the vast, glittering sea, and the bed was so soft it felt like sleeping on a cloud. "This is it," Lena whispered, her heart soaring. "This is exactly what we needed." They spent the first few hours just absorbing everything. Mark poured them both a glass of wine and they sat on the balcony as the sun set below the horizon. The quiet was only interrupted by the sound of waves crashing against the rocks below. By the time night fell, the resort had an eerily calm atmosphere. It felt like they were one of the few guests that existed in this world. The air was heavy with serenity, or so it seemed. The night soon wore on. Strange things started happening. It began small, the flicker of the lights, a soft sound they could not identify. At first it was dismissed as nothing. Perhaps the building just settled. But then, just before they dozed off, Lena was sure she heard a whisper. "Mark?" She called out, but he was fast asleep beside her. The whispering grew louder, as if coming from the walls. She strained her ears, trying to make out the words, but all she could hear was something like "leave, leave, leave." Her breath caught in her throat. She reached for Mark's hand, shaking him awake. "Mark, wake up," she whispered urgently. "Do you hear that?" Mark stirred, blinking groggily. "Hear what?" Lena pointed to the wall. Whispers ceased, but she still had a sense that something foreboding weighed the air. Mark shrugged half-heartedly, pushing her closer as he spoke into her ear. "It's just the wind, babe. Sleep." Lena couldn't quiet the feeling down. The rest of the night dragged out with an uncomfortable silence. The following day is a blur, with the duo spending their day by the pool, eating at one of the finest restaurants of a 5-star resort, and wandering by the beach. But the feel of uneasiness started when night fell once more. They were seated in the resort's ornate dining room for dinner when they began to overhear some of the other guests talking. The topic was from the previous night, a couple who had spent the night in a room not far from where Lena and Mark were, which said they also heard the same whispers. The couple was slightly shaken, but it was nothing that could stop them from ruining their vacation. Lena and Mark locked eyes. Perhaps, just perhaps, it wasn't only in their imaginations. And yet, they dismissed the seeping feeling of doom spreading around them slowly. Night number 3 proved much worse. Lena woke suddenly, her eyes snapping open to pitch-black darkness. The room was eerily still, too still, like time itself had stopped. She reached over to Mark, only to find his side of the bed empty. Panic surged through her. "Mark," she whispered urgently. She stood, her legs weak as she stumbled toward the door, but the knob wouldn't turn. It was locked from the outside. Her heart pounding, she thumped on the door. Mark opened the door, but nothing. No answer. No sound. Scared, Lena went to the window, but it was locked also. She could not get out. Her breathing accelerated as she realized something was terribly wrong. Minutes turned into hours. Time seemed to have lost all meaning. She pounded on the door again, shouting for Mark, but still, there was no answer. A sudden, loud bang made her freeze. She turned around slowly. There, standing in the far corner of the room, was a figure, a tall, shadowy silhouette, barely visible in the dim light. Lena's breath caught in her throat. She stepped back, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Mar?" she whispered, but the figure didn't move. The air felt heavy, thick with something that wasn't human. The door flew open, and Mark stumbled in, his face pale and his hair disheveled. "Lena, we have to get out of here," he gasped. Lena couldn't speak, not even. She was so dazed and barely could get the sense of what had occurred. The mysterious figure was no more. There was complete silence again in the room. Mark was shivering. "What? What the hell just happened?" she stammered. Mark dragged her hand to the door with his increased urgency. "I don't know, but something's off with this place. People disappear." They rushed through the corridors, but everything was disturbingly silent. The resort, once alive with activity, now felt abandoned. They saw other guests in the hallway, their faces pale and drawn. But if they tried to speak to them, the guests would just walk past, as if they did not even see them. "Where is everyone?" Lena whispered. "Something's happening," Mark said, his voice shaking. "I don't know what, but we need to leave, now." They headed to the main lobby, where they found it completely deserted. The receptionist's desk was abandoned and the lights flickered overhead. They approached the desk, searching for any clue, but before they could react, the power went out entirely. In the darkness, they heard footsteps behind them. Quick, purposeful, heavy. They spun around, but no one was there. Suddenly, the whispers returned, louder this time, as if 100 voices were calling out from the very walls. "Leave, leave, now. It's too late." Mark grabbed Lena's hand and pulled her towards the exit, but as they reached the door, they found it sealed shut. "We're trapped," Lena gasped, fear rising in her chest. Mark's face contorted with fear. "This is not just a resort, Lena. It's a prison." The hours ticked by, and the fear deepened. They frantically looked for an escape route, but every route they took seemed to lead them around in circles. Eventually, they found a hidden corridor, a narrow hallway that led down into the heart of the resort. It was there that they discovered the truth. The walls were covered with old photographs, faded and torn, depicting previous guests, families, couples, and groups of friends, all smiling happily. But as they moved down the hall, they began to notice something strange. Many of these guests were no longer there. Their faces had been scratched out. Lena's stomach churned. She felt the cold weight of dread settle over her. They reached the end of the hallway and entered a small, dimly lit room. On the wall was a painting, the only one that hadn't been destroyed or altered in any way. It depicted the resort in its early days, but in the background, there was something darker. A figure, tall, shadowy, and watching them. This is what's been doing it," Mark whispered. "It's not just the resort, it's cursed." The walls seemed to close in on them as they realized the horror that had been hidden in plain sight. The resort wasn't just haunted. It was a trap, one designed to lure in guests and never let them leave. But before they could run, the shadows engulfed them. The whispers became screams, and they were devoured by darkness. When the authorities came, Lena and Mark, along with the other missing guests, were nowhere to be found. The resort was abandoned, left to crumble into ruin, as if it had never existed. But at midnight, when the wind blows howling over the cliffs, there are some say you can hear the whispers of those who never made it out. Get out now."